Well, now is the time, is a moment to hear to Amy Young Evrard of Gettysburg College. And the title is The Missing Men of the Moroccan Women's Rights Movement. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on? Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here and talk to you about some rather old research at this point, but that I'm thinking about in a new way. So I appreciate your attention and questions. Men are not actually missing from the Moroccan women's rights movement, but they are missing in studies of the Moroccan women's rights movement and other ethnographies about women's activism and women's lives in general. This paper will suggest why that might be and what looking at the roles men play in the Moroccan women's rights movement can do to help us understand this movement and the women in it even better. In the introduction to her book, The New Arab Man, Emergent Masculinities, Technologies, and Islam in the Middle East, published in 2012, American anthropologist Marcia Inhorn gives a stark account of the inattention to men and masculinity in both anthropology and Middle East studies, which in the American academic system includes North Africa as well. She reviews 420 ethnographies written by anthropologists over the past 60 years. She doesn't say which anthropologists, but I have a feeling she means anthropologists publishing in the West and in English. Of the 420, Inhorn claims that none are of men and masculinity, including those that have words like gender in their title. By contrast, there are over 100 ethnographies of women in the Middle East. Yet, according to her, very few have examined men's and women's actual relationships within the context of marriage or other intimate settings, nor have they taken seriously the intertwining of men's and women's lives. Sabina's paper being a very nice exception to that. Yet, Inhorn writes, I argue that Middle Eastern patriarchy today is being unseated by Middle Eastern men themselves, who are questioning traditional notions of manhood. Patriarchy does persist in a variety of forms. However, we need to rethink whether patriarchy should remain the dominant theoretical trope. Better empiricism, actually studying men's lives and their relationships with women, might help to undo patriarchal assumptions in Middle Eastern gender studies. Yet, even in my own book manuscript, which in its title claims to be an ethnography of the Moroccan women's rights movement, I mostly leave men out of any significant discussions of the movement, from the women's rights associations it comprises to the important male allies in the human rights movement, in political parties, and in government. That is, with the exception of King Mohammed VI, whom I discuss as a problematic figure for women's rights activists, because it is he who has forced through their greatest achievement, the 2004 reform of the Moroccan Family Code. Yet, he is the very symbol of the patriarchal power that rules their lives and from which they hope the reform will free them in their personal, societal, workplace, and political lives. Thus, men are present in my narrative, vaguely representing patriarchy or as causing a specific problem for women, never as central actors themselves. Since reading Inhorn's book, I have been asking myself why scholars in both anthropology and Middle East studies have overlooked this important aspect, men, of studying women, and I suggest several reasons why this might be. First and foremost, I think we were in such a rush to provide a corrective to both anthropology and Middle East studies and decades of exclusion of women in their accounts of Middle Eastern societies. But now that we have such an outstanding corpus of work on women, including so much that has been published by women in the Middle East and North Africa themselves, perhaps especially Morocco, is it time to move on from this agenda? Secondly, I believe that we anthropologists tend to see the world in terms of men and women. And in the case of societies like Morocco, we have reified these as separate and even mutually exclusive spheres. But aren't there numerous family and other kinds of relationships between men and women that could have provided the ability to study these moments of interaction between them? Third, as it relates to women's movements, I think we have replaced the notion of a movement primarily concerning women with the notion of a movement comprising women. Similarly, as we have opposed women's rights activists to patriarchy, we have also slipped and opposed them to men. But surely men are also involved in certain aspects of questioning or acting to dismantle patriarchy. Couldn't we also begin to see men as partners or allies of women addressing patriarchy? In short, I have come to the worrying conclusion that we have left men out of our studies of women and women's movements because we see them as less important than women, less integral to the processes of mobilizing women and fighting for women's rights. But isn't that analogous to decades of male anthropologists who didn't study women because they saw women as less integral to the processes of building cultural, political, historical, legal, and other kinds of institutions that were the stuff of society? Asking this series of questions forced me to look back through my data from years of studying individuals and associations involved in the Moroccan women's rights movement, research carried out mostly in 2002 and 2003, with some follow-up research in 2008. I carried out ethnographic fieldwork for a total of 14 months among individuals and associations involved in what I categorized as the Moroccan women's rights movement. There are other ways of thinking, of course, about women's movements in Morocco, including a breadth of projects from development to reproductive rights to religious piety and beyond. My focus was on a particular portion of those efforts, encompassing individuals and associations who shared the following two primary goals: reform of the Mudawanat al-Usra and education of women in Moroccan society more broadly about women's human rights. As you know, a new Mudawana was implemented in 2004, instituting on paper a long list of reforms for which women's rights activists had fought since the 1980s. Of course, lots of loopholes remained, so associations have continued their work to improve the actual implementation of the reforms, in part by educating women about their rights as women and as humans through a variety of programs. And by the way, I have to publicize that my book on this, which will be entitled The Moroccan Women's Rights Movement, is forthcoming in the next few months with Syracuse University Press in the United States, and I hope you'll read it. In my analysis, there are four distinct realms of direct male activity in the women's rights movement. First of all, men provide leadership within women's rights and related associations. In the more established women's associations, those that emerged in the 1970s and 1980s as women's cells within a number of political parties, men are almost non-existent at the upper levels of leadership, except notably as husbands or friends or colleagues who actively support the work of women in these leadership roles. However, if we expand the definition of the women's rights movement to include a larger set of associations that are actively working for reform and implementation of the Mudawana and the education of women about their rights, we see several men in leadership. For example, the microcredit lending agency Zakura, which requires its female loan recipients to attend classes on women's rights and human rights. Another example is Shula, the youth association of the USFP, which has worked explicitly to teach women's rights to its membership and to train female leaders within the association. Additionally, the male counterparts of women's rights associations are active within their political parties or human rights associations, which often, although not always, act as important allies for the women's rights movement. And finally, in a generation of newer women's rights associations growing up in a more grassroots fashion, men are very active in leadership. For example, I spent a great deal of time with one association, Aman, that a group of friends in the neighborhood of Sidi Yusuf bin Ali in Marrakesh had founded together in order to teach human rights concepts to girls at risk. Among the 10 or so founders of this association, 2 were male. Likewise, men in offices of political power have taken a leadership role in pushing for women's rights. For example, one longtime activist, a woman, was telling me about her close work with Said Saadi, the former Secretary of State charged with the family, during his work on the 1999 Plan of Action for the Integration of Women in Development. This activist told me, and even there are men in government who are convinced and who work like Said Saadi. He had these things in his heart, and he authored the Plan of Action. I cannot say that he's not a feminist. There are male volunteers who provide legal counsel, who teach literacy classes for adult women, who show up at protests, and do other work integral to the programming of women's rights associations. I asked one female activist at a major women's rights association headquartered in Rabat, do women come here seeking help divorcing a violent and abusive husband feel uncomfortable meeting with the volunteer lawyer who is a man? She answered, no, because they know that for him to be volunteering with this association, he must be even more convinced than the rest of us, so they trust him. A second realm of men's participation is as supportive family members. As I spent hours and weeks and months sitting in association waiting rooms in order to observe or talk with people, I noticed that many women who came to the association seeking help or attending a training session were accompanied by male family members. Brothers accompanied sisters, husbands accompanied wives, fathers accompanied daughters, friends accompanied friends. This not only indicates men's roles in women's rights issues, but also in the lives of women more generally, returning to Marcia Inhorn's point about the intertwining of men's and women's lives. Women rely on their families, including men, to help with problems ranging from spousal violence to sexual assault by a neighbor to unwanted advances by men on the street, and they rely on this support from men in their lives. Third, men also exist positively in the imaginations of female women's rights activists, especially as fathers who encourage them to pursue education and a professional life, or more generally to think of themselves as equals to men or human beings with dignity. Many activists spoke to me of how their fathers or brothers inspired and encouraged them. We know from several sources about colonial and post-colonial nationalism in the Middle East and North Africa that men were integral to promoting women's education as part of a nation-building project that would strengthen the nation by strengthening the family through women. So this is where I think that gender theorists and feminist anthropologists, this is where we start to see the danger of looking at men as integral members of a women's rights movement. Fathers, not mothers, become the inspirational role model because they have the authority to decide whether or not a daughter can pursue education and a professional life. Saeed Saadi or King Mohammed VI become the heroes for championing plans for reform because they have the authority to do so. Male volunteer lawyers are credited as being more convinced than long-term female activists who have put their entire lives into the women's rights movement. I think that we start to feel concerned that men are still leading, guiding, and making decisions that will affect the success of the women's rights movement and the individuals and associations involved in it. And we wonder, how can women dismantle patriarchy if they must depend on men to help them do so? So we eliminate these men from consideration in favor of showing that these are movements by women, of women, and for women. But again, I think this is the wrong solution to the problem. Assuming that men's presence in these important roles subtracts from women's accomplishments is again to see this as an either-or proposition, rather than looking at how men and women work together in various ways to promote legal reform and the education of women about their rights. Examining men's participation might allow us to see that those men have come into leadership roles through their relationships with women and through the ways that the women in their lives have shaped their understandings of women's rights. The fourth and final category is this. Just as men loom positively in the imaginations of these women, so do they loom negatively. I asked one interview, a social worker who had spent years counseling women victims of violence, if she had plans to marry. She stared ruefully at me and said, "How can I marry? I look around me and see monsters." I attended an annual event sponsored by the Union d'Action Féminine, in which several women who had sought legal help and support from the association gave testimony in front of a judge and jury comprising mostly men from the Women's Rights and Human Rights Association community, an event meant to expose the physical and juridical violence faced by women and to put the Moroccan legal system itself on trial. As these women told their stories of abusive spouses, deadbeat sons-in-law, and violent rapists, the audience of some 1,500 people, mostly women, booed and hissed and stomped their feet at these men and the ways that they had harmed women and at the legal system that had further victimized these women. But even these men cannot be dismissed as an important part of our understanding of the Moroccan women's rights movement. Are all monsters the same, sharing the same motivations? Is there no more to the lives and relationships of men and women than these moments of violence or disputes over divorce and child custody? Are there no complexities in men's lives, forms of structural violence perhaps, that contextualize their violent behaviors? Do all men have or use the same authority against all women? Likewise, are all male judges equally likely to interpret the law in a way that harms women? Or are all male politicians equally likely to use their authority to block the advancement of women's rights? Clearly, the answer to these questions is no. Unfortunately, as scholars, and also, I might add, women's rights activists themselves, we have made these men into flat, stock characters instead of the complex human beings that they are, just as women, instead of the complex human beings that they are. And by saying all this, this is not to dismiss or explain away violence, but to say that there is a lot to understand about this violence and these other negative behaviors that exist in the lives and imaginations of these women. There's a lot more to say about these men who are such problems for women and for the women's rights movement. So to study women without studying these men is not to fully understand the movement and the women it comprises. In these 4 ways, and no doubt many others, men play a crucial role in the lives of women and of the women's rights movement in Morocco. And I believe this brief paper, I hope, demonstrates that it's time to bring men into our anthropological studies more generally of women's activism and indeed of women themselves. Thank you.